Hey friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and today I spent the day readying my wood stove. We're approaching our first frost here in a couple days. Temperatures are just going to be a high in the 50s, low in the 30s, and so it is really feeling like autumn. It's the season of firing up the wood stove. It just feels wonderful. I love this time of year. And something else that really reminds me of this time of year is fresh apple cider. We absolutely love it, and we had the opportunity this past week to go pick up some of our apple cider for the year. Now, we do have fruit trees on our property, but they are not mature enough to meet our fruit needs at this point. So we do purchase a lot of bulk fruit from local farmers, and there's a lovely family where we live that they press cider 3 times in the fall, and this was just the first pressing. So we got 12 gallons of apple cider this time, and in this video I'm going to show you what I plan to do with that cider. We had some fun projects. We're going to make some dairy-free caramels, like a candy. We're going to also make a caramel sauce that we can. I had a apple cider coffee cake that I made for breakfast one day. We're going to make apple cider vinegar from scratch and more. Just lots of fun things to do in this video. So if you would like to go ahead and skip to that point, why don't you go ahead and go to this part. But first, I just want to clarify something for my foreign viewers. I always get this question whenever I talk about apple cider, especially giving it to my children. I know that I think in Europe, apple cider is always alcoholic. That is not the case here in America. So if you're confused about that and wondering why I'm giving all of this alcohol to my children, apple cider in America, it does not contain alcohol. Hard cider is the name for that type of alcoholic cider beverage. If it's just plain apple cider, that is simply just the raw or pasteurized, unfiltered juice of pressed apples. So when we're buying apple cider, it is simply they took the apples, they pressed them down, they collected that juice and bottled it up. If it's raw, it's just bottled up that way. If it's pasteurized, it's heated to a point where pathogens and bacteria could be killed. So typically what you get in the grocery store is a pasteurized apple cider. When you go to a farm or an orchard where they're pressing it there themselves, it's usually a raw cider that you're getting. Now that's different than an apple juice that you would get in the store, which is typically filtered. So that accounts for the difference in color. When you get an apple cider, it's usually a darker, almost a brown color, whereas an apple juice is a golden yellow color, and that's simply because the juice has filtered out all of the solids, and those solids, when they begin to oxidize, just like with an apple slice, kind of turn brown, and that gives that apple cider that brown color. But when you filter out all of those solids, what is left behind is the pure just juice, which is kind of that golden yellow color. So I just wanted to clarify those different words for you, so that there's no confusion. Nope, we're not giving alcohol to the kids. That would be hard cider, would be the alcoholic form. So, just last common question that I get, when we purchase bulk cider like this, it is good in the fridge, in my experience, for about 7 to 10 days. I've read online where some people say 2 to 4 weeks. In my experience, it's best when it is drank within 7 to 10 days. But if you have it in the fridge and it's past that 10 days and you're kind of worried if it's iffy and if you should drink it or not, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to show you what you can do with that apple cider, not have to pour it out and waste it if it's past the date where you think it's good for drinking. So let's go ahead and get started. So you have a gallon of apple cider and you're kind of iffy on whether or not you should drink it. All you need to do is grab a clean glass gallon jar or some other type of container with a wide mouth that will hold a gallon of your cider, or however much cider you have left over in your jug. And you're just going to pour it in there. You're probably wondering why it needs to be wide mouth and why we couldn't just leave it in the jug. And I'm going to show you in a little bit. We're going to add a mother of vinegar to this batch, and you want to be able to reach your hand into the jug to retrieve it after your vinegar has fermented. So I'm going to get out my little hotel of mothers of vinegar here. If you're not sure what this is the colony of bacteria that is created when you ferment a batch of vinegar.
And once that vinegar is done, you can remove this colony of bacteria and just store it in your fridge until you're ready to make a new batch of vinegar. And this will just simply speed up the fermentation process. If you don't have a mother left over from a previous batch, just using a little bit of vinegar that has the mother in it, you can get store-bought vinegar with the mother, that would work. And don't worry, if you don't even have that, you can just put the plain cider into your jar and skip this step. This mother or that vinegar is just going to speed up the fermentation process and take it maybe 3 months for it to turn into vinegar, versus if you don't have the mother or the vinegar, it will still turn into apple cider vinegar. It just might take you 9 months instead of that 3 months. So don't worry, pour your vinegar in there, put a mother in it if you have that, and then put something breathable on the top. I like to use a coffee filter. You can use cheesecloth. You just want something that will allow airflow but isn't going to let pests like fruit flies get into your jar here. And then you're going to tie it off. Some yarn works lovely. My daughter, I asked her to get me some yarn, and of course she got me hot pink. But if you have a large rubber band, that's even more convenient. I didn't have any rubber bands available, so my hot pink yarn will have to do for today. So we're just going to tie that up, and then we're going to take it somewhere and just let it sit. It's really that simple to make apple cider vinegar. Like I said, if you put that mother in there, it might only take 3 months. If you didn't, it could take 9 months to even a year. You're just going to taste it every now and then to see if it has fermented properly. I put the date that we started this batch on the outside of the jar just so I can remember how many months it's been. And we're going to take it down into the cellar, and it's going to turn into vinegar. The cooler the environment that you have it in, the slower the fermentation process is. You can see I've got lots of batches of old vinegar up here that's all bottled up once it reaches the right acidity and taste. But that is the first step of making your vinegar. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to our first recipe. We're going to make some dairy-free caramels. I'm going to start by taking 4 cups of apple cider, and I'm going to put it in a pot on the stove and put that on boiling. While it's starting to boil, I'm going to assemble all of my other ingredients, and later on I'll show you what all of these ingredients are, but you just want to make sure you get them all measured out and ready, because once your apple cider hits a boiling point where it's syrupy, you can scorch it really easily. So if you have all of your other ingredients measured out and ready to go just sitting there, you're not going to have to take the time to measure that out later on and risk scorching and burning your cider here that you worked so hard to boil down into a syrup, because it can take you about 40 minutes or so to get it boiled down, and you just want it to thicken. It will turn into almost the consistency of like a maple syrup, and that is what we're going for. Now, once you hit that point where it's at that maple syrup texture and consistency, go ahead and turn your heat down for a little bit so you don't scorch this, and start adding your other ingredients. I'm going to put 3/4 a cup of maple syrup. You can also use honey if you would like instead, but I just really think the flavor of maple syrup complements the apple cider really well. It just makes a really good caramel. So you can use either or. We're also going to add 1/2 a cup of white sugar. You could also use brown sugar if you prefer that taste, or even maybe just add a little bit of blackstrap molasses to your white sugar if you prefer that brown sugar taste. We're going to add 1/3 a cup of coconut cream. You do need something thick. If you're making this dairy-free, coconut cream definitely works the best. And then you're going to need some kind of fat, 1/2 a cup of fat that is solid at room temperature and melts when it gets hot. I like to use coconut oil. You could use palm fruit shortening. You could use even lard if you wanted to. I just find coconut oil is the best taste. If you don't have to be dairy-free, you could just use regular cream and butter for those ingredients, and that's going to turn out tasty as well. So we're just trying to melt all of that coconut oil. We're going to put a candy thermometer in there and bring it back up to a boil. And we want the temperature of the contents of this pot to reach 252 degrees. It's important that you don't get it hotter than that, or it might start to set like a hard candy. And if it doesn't quite reach that temperature, then you're not going to get it to set into the caramel, like the sticky caramel texture that you need. So it really is important that you use a candy thermometer and get it to that right temperature. We're going to prepare our baking dish that we're going to pour this into, and as soon as it reaches that 250 degrees, we're immediately taking it off of the stove so that it doesn't get any hotter than that. And now we're going to add our other ingredients. These are completely optional. I'm putting 1 teaspoon of cinnamon there. You could do less cinnamon if you wanted to, or even omit that if you don't like a cinnamon flavor. We like a lot of cinnamon, so we did 1 teaspoon. And then we're using a coarse salt. I just have coarse pink Himalayan salt here, but you could use any kind. And we're just going to put, you can see I'm just pinching a little bit of it, maybe the equivalent of 1/4 of a teaspoon, if that, and stirring that into the mixture. We have our parchment paper lined baking dish here, and I'm using a spatula to make sure I get every last drop of that caramel we worked so hard to boil down into the baking dish, and we put that in the fridge for a couple hours to let it set. And in the meantime, I'm taking more parchment paper and I'm just cutting it into little rectangular shapes. These are what we're going to use to wrap up our little candies after they're all done. Speaking of being done, after a couple hours, it's hard enough that I can just pull that parchment paper out of the baking dish and get ready to cut it. Now, something that's really going to help you cut this is add a little bit of coconut oil to your knife. That's going to help that knife slide through that caramel without sticking to it, because it is rather sticky and chewy. So once again, use that oil or else you might end up with a mess on your knife and you're going to have a really hard time cutting through it. You can make these whatever size and shape that you like. I make some that are larger, some that are smaller, because some of my little ones don't want to have a big one, but some of my teenagers want to have a larger bite. And then I'm just going to take my little parchment paper pieces and wrap these up. If you were making these maybe for a holiday gift, you could get really cute and add some fun string or something that would be in cute colors, or you could use different colors of parchment paper and decorate it or something. These make a really nice gift, but when you have 8 children, this amount right here won't last long enough to gift extras to anybody. These will mostly be for the children, and so I'm just going to get them wrapped up. I'm going to leave some unwrapped for them to taste test for me, and it's really that simple. These are absolutely delicious. If you know anybody with a dairy allergy or dairy intolerance that can't eat traditional caramels, this is just a wonderful treat for them. So make sure you try this out. They can be stored in a jar like this, on the shelf if you are going to eat them quickly. If you're not going to eat them quickly, maybe put them in the fridge so they'll last a little longer. And as you can see, they absolutely loved these. They won't last very long for us, but it's just a fun treat. We enjoy making these every year during apple cider season. It's just one of those things that we all look forward to. Now, another thing that we look forward to is just a basic caramel sauce. And so we're going to do the same thing. I'm starting out with a large pot. I'm going to use an entire gallon jug of cider for this. And we're going to pour it into the pot. And we're going to get that boiling on the stove. And just like with the caramel candies, the cider is going to need to boil down and thicken up into a syrupy texture. Now, I like to add a cinnamon stick to this pot to give it some cinnamon flavor. And this large of a pot is going to take well over an hour to cook down. So you just come in every now and then and stir it and make sure nothing is sticking as it's thickening up. But you just have to be patient, and it will make your house smell amazing. So enjoy those scents of fall. Once it boils down about halfway, about half of the liquid has evaporated, I like to pull out that cinnamon stick as it starts to turn into more of a syrupy texture. And once it gets thicker, I do need to kind of stay in the kitchen and stir it more frequently. And then once I'm satisfied with the texture, once again, I've got that kind of maple syrupy texture, I'm going to add in my sugar. I'm just doing 2 cups of white sugar added to that 1 gallon of apple cider that has been boiling down. Then once again, we're going to need to get out our candy thermometer, but this time we're only going to let it get to about 218 degrees. We're not trying to make a solid caramel candy. We want it to get to a thick, syrupy texture. And so once I achieve that 218 degrees, I'm going to start putting it in my jars here. I like to use various sizes of jars just for the different uses that I'll use this for. Sometimes the little jars make good gifts. Sometimes we want a lot of caramel. Sometimes we just want to drizzle this over a dessert. And then I had a little bit extra left over that I'll show you how I'm going to use later. Of course, this is super sticky, So we're going to wipe the rims of our jars, and then we're going to get our 4 jars canning lids on top of the jars. Remember that if you need 10% off some canning lids, check out the link in the video description and use my code, and you can get 10% off your canning lids. These are the ones I use exclusively for all of the canning, and you guys know I do a lot of canning throughout the year, so make sure you get that good deal. Check out the deals they have in the fall. They typically have extra sales that you can bundle the coupon code on top of. We're going to get our rings on these jars, and they're going to go in the water bath canner for 10 minutes. Once we're done, we have a shelf-stable apple cider caramel sauce that is just amazing. Now, as it's coming out hot of the canner, you're going to see that the texture still looks kind of runny and watery, and that is perfectly normal. I want to show you with this extra that I have. You can see that while it's still hot, it is very liquidy, and that is perfectly fine because I'm going to show you, we put it in the fridge. This was just in the fridge for maybe 30 to 45 minutes, and already it has really thickened up. And that is how you get that syrupy texture. This is delicious, drizzled over like vanilla ice cream and other desserts like that. We are going to enjoy this all year long. So tasty. Speaking of tasty, I want to make an apple cider coffee cake for the children for breakfast. So I am starting by measuring out 1.5 cups of apple cider. We're going to get that on that stove and let it cook down, decrease by half. And then I'm going to start getting all of my cake ingredients ready. So we have 1.5 cups of flour. I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And then we're going to add 1 teaspoon of baking soda. Now we're going to get out our spices. We like cinnamon, so we're going to do 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. We're also going to add 1 teaspoon of nutmeg, and then I'm just going to do a 1/2 teaspoon of ground ginger. But adjust those spices however you like it. You could add a little clove, allspice, whatever you like to add to things like this. And then 1 teaspoon of salt. We're doing a 1/2 cup of white sugar. And then we're going to kind of mix all those dry ingredients together a little bit before I start adding some more of my wet ingredients. Now we need to add our fat. So I'm going to do 6 tablespoons of fat. You once again want a fat that is solid at room temperature. We are using palm fruit shortening here. Anything would work. Butter, lard, coconut oil, whatever your preferred fat that is solid at room temperature. And then you want 1 large egg, or I have some baby hens that have just started laying, so we used 2 of their tiny eggs, as well as 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. And then I'm adding 1/3 a cup of, this is coconut yogurt, or you could use coconut cream, whatever you have in the fridge. Now this next ingredient is optional, but I just think it adds a little something extra to the coffee cake. But if you don't have any fresh apples in the house, you could completely skip this and it's not gonna really affect the cake recipe that much. But I take 2 small apples and kind of chop them up into little cubes, and I like to add that to my batter. I just think it gives a little extra apple flavor that is really delicious. And because I used white sugar instead of brown sugar, I'm just adding a little bit of a drizzle of blackstrap molasses. Our apple cider has cooked down by half, and so we're just going to add that. And then we need to get all of this mixed together. I'm using my Bosch mixer here. And while that is mixing, I'm going to work on making the crumble topping for the top of the coffee cake. So I'm starting with a 1/2 cup of flour. The next thing we're going to add is our fat. Once again, I'm using palm fruit shortening, and we are just going to add 3 tablespoons of that palm fruit shortening. The next thing we're going to add is sugar. I'm doing a 1/4 cup of sugar, and honestly, the kids said this cake was really sweet because we're going to put a glaze on top of it, so I would almost leave out that sugar if I were going to make it again, but I would add that cinnamon. I just drizzled a little bit of cinnamon over the top, just kind of eyeballing it. But if you don't like things that are super sweet, leave the sugar out of this crumble topping because you are going to glaze over the top of the cake eventually too. So all right, we have all our ingredients mixed up and ready to go. I like to use a pie dish. It's kind of the perfect size for this cake. but we are going to grease it really well because we're going to want to slip the cake out of the pie dish in order to cut it up and serve it. So just greasing that really well. We got our batter in there, and then we're going to take our crumble topping and just put that all over the top of the cake. I have my oven preheated to 350 degrees, and we're just going to bake that until we get a toothpick to come out clean out of the center of that. I want to say it was somewhere between 45 to 50 minutes maybe. And it smells amazing, so delicious. I made this the night before, and then in the morning all I had to do was glaze it. So I had that leftover syrup that was just in that little dish that Hannah absolutely loved dipping her fingers into. Oops. Now we're just going to add a little bit of powdered sugar to that syrup, and then we're going to add some apple cider as the liquid to turn this into a sugar glaze. Now remember, when you make something like a sugar glaze, you don't want to add too much liquid or it's going to be super runny, and you're not going to get that nice glaze texture on the top of your baked good. So I just start with a little bit, like that was just a tiny, maybe less than a half a teaspoon of liquid, and then you can always add more. But if you add too much liquid in the beginning, then you're going to have to keep adding powdered sugar to get it to the right texture, and you're going to end up with way too much glaze. So just start with a little liquid and then continue to add a little more until you get it to the right texture. Like I said, you want to have it rather thick so that when you drizzle it over the top, it doesn't just run completely over the sides. You want some of that glaze to stick to the top of your cake so that you get a nice thick layer of that glaze over the top of it. So I'm just taking a spoon and kind of drizzling it, and then we're going to leave it in the pie dish for a little while to kind of let that glaze solidify and set for a few seconds before we're going to pull that cake out of the pie dish and get ready to cut it up and serve it. Looks so delicious, smells amazing. The kids are going to love this. This is a rather sugary treat, so I know some of you are going to say that's too much sugar for breakfast, but we served it with a little bit of fruit, and we made sure to give some protein. And you know what? The kids loved it, and I think it's not going to hurt them to have treats like this every once in a while. So we are flying through these apple cider jugs. We're drinking them fresh too, and you're probably wondering, what do I do with all of these? Well, we are going to save these, wash them out, put them in the garage, and then in January when we do our winter sowing, we're going to turn these jugs into little greenhouses and plant seeds in them and put them outside. And I have videos on how to do this, and I'll make sure to show you guys more about this winter.
Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed all those little tutorials. I want to remind you that I have a couple links in the video description just talking about other Apple products. I discussed apple cider vinegar in this video, but if you don't have access to raw apple cider and you want to make some vinegar, I have videos explaining how you can make apple scrap vinegar, which is just as delicious and healthy for you. I'm going to put a link to that video in the description. I'm also going to link a video that shows you, I think it's 8 different ways or 5 different ways to preserve apple products. So different canning projects you can do, like applesauce, apple pie filling, apple barbecue sauce, apple jelly, which is something that I will sometimes do with leftover apple cider. I didn't do it in this video, but if you want a tutorial on how to turn apple juice or apple cider into a jelly, you can check out that video that I'm going to link, and it will give you all instructions and recipes for how to do that. So speaking of canning, another common question I get is, why do I freeze my apple cider? Why don't I can it? Because that would clear up space in the freezers. And actually, you know, from that perspective, that would be ideal. It would be shelf stable. But I just want to talk a little bit about why I choose not to do that. And so there's a difference, as I mentioned in the beginning, between raw apple cider and pasteurized apple cider. So raw apple cider has not been heated at all. It is just that freshly pressed juice from the apples, whereas pasteurized apple cider has been heated to a point where it can kill any potential bacteria and pathogens that could be in the cider. I completely understand why any store-bought cider you get at the grocery store would need to be pasteurized. It would be impossible to ensure with lengthy travels, getting things to and from the grocery store, you know, that you're not going to create some food poisoning outbreak by leaving this raw cider, you know, in the grocery stores. But when you're going directly to a farmer and an orchard where you know everything was clean, it was collected in sanitary conditions, you brought it directly home, put it right in the fridge, it's a lot safer to drink a raw product that way. And it's the same as it is with any other kind of raw product directly from the farm, raw honey, raw dairy products. There are health benefits to consuming that item raw. There are also risks to consuming it raw. So if you're someone with a compromised immune system, you know, you always want to have your things pasteurized if you're really worried about bacteria and things like that. But when it comes to cider, in the raw form, there are health benefits to that if we were to heat it through the canning process, you would lose a lot of that. One of those benefits is the vitamin C content. So apple cider is high in vitamin C. If you can it, any type of heat destroys vitamin C. So during the winter months when we don't have access to a whole lot of fresh fruits and veggies to get our vitamin C, you know, directly from the garden or directly from fruit, it is nice to be able to pull a gallon of apple cider, raw apple cider, out of the freezer, thaw it, drink it, and get a little bit of vitamin C. If I canned it, I would lose those health benefits. So that is why we choose not to can it. Now, there are a lot of apple products that I do can that I just mentioned, like apple pie filling, apple butter, things like that, but I'm not necessarily consuming those for the nutritional benefits. Those are treats and things. Even things like applesauce, it is by nature a food that has already been heated. You had to heat it to create the applesauce, so canning it to get it shelf stable, you're not destroying any more nutrients. That vitamin C is already gone. So when it comes to something though, we're going to the effort to purchase it raw for those nutritional benefits. I just want to preserve those raw nutrients in the freezer. So what we do, because our family can go through a gallon at least of cider in one meal, is it is a very rare treat. I mentioned that the family that we get our cider from, they do 3 pressings in the season, usually one in the beginning of October, one towards the middle to end of October, one maybe in the beginning of November. It just kind of depends on the weather patterns that year. And the cider, the longer you go into the season and the cooler the temperatures get, it really sweetens and it's much more delicious. So typically this first run of cider that we get from the farm that we go to, that's more for our cooking and baking purposes, a lot of the projects that I did today in this video. If we want to preserve it for drinking for later in the year, I will typically use the cider that we get later in the season because it is just much more delicious for drinking. It's super sweet and tasty. And so I try to, as I mentioned, make it a treat because freezing those gallon jugs takes up a lot of freezer space. So we really only freeze enough for maybe 1 or 2 meals a month throughout the rest of the year. Maybe a maximum of 20 gallons of cider will go into the freezer for our family. We alternate that cider with the fresh pressed lemon juice that I do throughout the winter to make homemade lemonade. So every weekend we maybe have a big special family dinner, and maybe one week we'll do cider, the next week we'll do homemade lemonade, the next week we'll do cider. And that kind of spaces it out. For big meals like Thanksgiving or children's birthdays or New Year's Eve, cider is just a special treat that we'll get out for the children on those occasions. So that is what we will do. I'm trying to think if there are any other questions that we get a lot when it comes to cider. I think I've touched on most of it, the reasons why we preserve it, how we preserve it, and some of the fun things that we like to do with it. But if you can come up with any other questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll be happy to address them. So hopefully, if you get your hands on some delicious apple cider here over these autumn months, I've given you some fun ideas to try, especially if you're a dairy-free family and you can't have traditional milk-based caramels that are in the store. Try those apple cider caramels. Your dairy-free people will love them. They're super tasty. So, all right, friends, I'm going to get back to it, and I hope you guys are having a lovely week. We'll be back next week with another video. Until then, have a great week, friends. Bye.